She gave her last coin to the preacher, then walked into the saloon and shot the man who stole her name. The silver dollar caught the dying light as it tumbled into the collection plate, a small sun falling into darkness. Martha, though that name belonged to someone else now, someone buried beneath 3 years of borrowed breath, watched it settle among the other offerings with the finality of a headstone. "Bless you, sister," the preacher murmured, his eyes already sliding past her to the next penitent. But blessing was a luxury she could no longer afford, and mercy had proven itself a fool's currency in this harsh country. She stood at the back of the makeshift church, really just the schoolhouse with its desks pushed aside for Sunday service, feeling the weight of empty pockets like a physical ache. The congregation swayed to hymns about salvation and redemption, their voices rising toward heaven while her thoughts descended toward hell. Through the window, she could see the saloon across the dusty street, its painted sign promising whiskey and forgetting. The preacher spoke of turning the other cheek, of love conquering all, of the meek inheriting the earth. Pretty words that meant nothing when you'd already given everything and received only emptiness in return. She tried being meek. She tried being good. She tried believing that justice would find its way to her door like morning light. But morning light had shown her only what she'd lost. Her hand drifted to the shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, feeling the cold metal beneath the wool. The Colt .45 had been Henry's, back when Henry was still her husband and not just a memory that tasted like copper pennies. Back when she had a name that meant something more than the hollow echo of what used to be. The hymn ended, and the congregation began to file out, their Sunday clothes rustling like dry leaves. She remained in her pew, watching through the window as lamplight began to glow behind the saloon's batwing doors. Soon the piano would start, and the laughter would spill into the street like water from a broken dam. And he would be there, Thomas Crane. The name sat bitter on her tongue, a curse disguised as introduction. He'd taken her husband's ranch, her security, her future, but worst of all, he'd taken her name. In the legal papers, in the town records, in the whispered gossip that followed her like smoke, she was no longer Martha Henley, beloved wife and respected woman. She was just another widow, without claim or consequence, invisible as dust. The preacher approached as the last of the congregation departed. "Are you well, sister? You seem troubled." Troubled, as if her pain were merely a passing storm cloud, something that could be weathered with enough prayer and patience. She looked up at him, this young man with his soft hands and softer certainties, and wondered if he'd ever watched everything he loved disappear into another man's greed. "I gave my last coin," she said simply. "The Lord will provide," he replied, the words automatic as breathing. "Will he?" She stood, her joints protesting after the long service. "I've been waiting 3 years for provision. 3 years for justice. Perhaps the Lord expects me to provide for myself." Something in her tone made him step back, his eyes widening slightly. Good. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being dismissed, tired of being nothing more than a footnote in other people's stories. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord," he said softly. "Then he's taking his time about it." She walked past him toward the door, her boots echoing in the empty schoolhouse. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of dust and distant rain that would never come. The saloon's laughter grew louder, more raucous, punctuated by the tinkling of piano keys and the clink of bottles. At the crossroads between the church and the saloon, she paused. Behind her lay everything she'd tried to be. The good woman, the faithful widow, the patient servant waiting for divine justice. Ahead lay everything she'd been afraid to become. But fear was another luxury she could no longer afford. Her reflection stared back at her from the saloon's painted window, a ghost of the woman she'd once been. Martha Henley had died the day Thomas Crane forged those papers, the day he stole her husband's signature and claimed what wasn't his to take. What walked toward those swinging doors now was something harder, something forged in loss and tempered by betrayal. The Colt's weight had become familiar over these long months of planning, of waiting, of hoping that somehow the world would right itself without her intervention. But the world, she'd learned, had no interest in justice for women like her, women without money or influence or powerful friends. The batwing doors swung open at her touch, and she stepped from the realm of prayer into the kingdom of sin. The air inside was thick with smoke and possibility, heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Behind her, the church bell began to toll, whether for evening prayer or something darker, she couldn't say. But as she walked deeper into the saloon's amber light, she knew that whatever happened next, she would finally stop being invisible. The last echo of the bell faded into silence, and Martha Henley, or whoever she was now, prepared to reclaim what had always been hers. The saloon's amber light fell across her face like honey over stone as she pushed through the crowd of Saturday night revelers. Smoke hung in the air like incense in a devil's church, and the piano player's fingers danced across keys worn smooth by 1,000 desperate melodies. She found him exactly where she knew he'd be, at the poker table in the back corner, his chair angled so he could watch both the game and the room. Thomas Crane had grown comfortable in his stolen prosperity, his vest buttons straining over a belly fed on other people's misery. The gold watch chain that had belonged to her Henry caught the lamplight, glinting like a serpent's eye. 3 years. 3 years since he'd walked into the courthouse with papers bearing her dead husband's signature. A signature she'd watched Henry write 1,000 times, but which looked somehow different in those moments when lawyers nodded and judges stamped their approval. 3 years since the ranch, the cattle, the life she'd built beside a good man, had simply ceased to belong to her. Martha Henley, the banker had said when she tried to withdraw money from their account. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no account under that name. Perhaps you're thinking of the Crane account." That was the moment she'd understood. It wasn't just property he'd stolen. It was her very existence. In the eyes of the law, in the records that mattered, Martha Henley had never existed at all. She was a ghost haunting her own life, invisible and powerless. But ghosts, she'd learned, could move through the world in ways the living never could. She ordered whiskey at the bar, her voice steady despite the storm building in her chest. The bartender, a man she'd once known as Jimmy Fletcher, back when she was somebody worth knowing, looked right through her as he poured. She'd become expert at reading that look, the way eyes slid past her, as if she were nothing more than shadow and suggestion. From her position at the bar, she could see Crane's table clearly. He was winning. Naturally, the devil's own luck had always favored him. His laughter boomed across the room as he raked in another pot, and she felt each note of it like a physical blow. "That Thomas Crane," said a voice beside her. A cowboy she didn't recognize, deep in his cups and eager to share gossip. "Lucky bastard. Came from nothing and now owns half the county. Course, some say he ain't entirely honest about how he came by it all. Some say," she replied carefully, taking a sip of whiskey that burned like liquid regret. "Well, you know how it is. Man dies sudden-like, and sometimes papers get confused, especially when there's money involved." The cowboy's eyes were knowing, conspiratorial. Poor widow Henley, for instance. Lost everything when her husband passed. Shame, really. She was a fine woman. The glass trembled in her hand. Oh, she disappeared some time back. Some folks think she went back east of family. Others reckon the grief got to her, if you catch my meaning. He made a gesture toward his temple. Desert's full of bones, they say. Easy to get lost out there. So that was the story they told. Martha Henley hadn't been murdered. She'd simply faded away, another casualty of frontier life's casual cruelties. It was almost elegant in its simplicity, this erasure of her existence. "Terrible shame," she murmured. "Aye, but that's life out here. Strong survive, weak get buried." The cowboy drained his glass and wandered away, leaving her alone with her rage and her whiskey. At the poker table, Crane was telling a story, his voice carrying over the general din. "So I told the widow, 'Ma'am, your husband signed these papers fair and square. Can't help it if he didn't tell you about them.' Course, she carried on something fierce, crying and such. Women, you know how they get." The other players laughed, and she felt something cold and final settle in her chest. He was making entertainment of her grief, turning her loss into barroom humor. The weight of the Colt beneath her shawl seemed to grow heavier, more insistent. She'd spent months planning this moment, learning his habits, his haunts, his weaknesses. She knew he came to the saloon every Saturday, knew he favored the corner table, knew he always sat with his back to the wall. She knew about the derringer in his vest pocket, the knife in his boot, the way his hand moved toward his gun when he was nervous. But she also knew he'd never expect danger from a woman who officially didn't exist. Moving through the crowd was like swimming through molasses, each step deliberate and final. The piano music seemed to slow, the laughter to dim, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The Colt's grip was warm against her palm, familiar as prayer. Crane looked up as her shadow fell across the table, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place her face. Recognition dawned slowly, like sunrise over a battlefield, and she saw the exact moment he remembered who she used to be. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a ghost." The other players turned to look at her, their faces curious and slightly drunk. She stood perfectly still, letting them see her, letting the moment stretch like a bowstring. "Hello, Thomas," she said, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet that had fallen over their corner of the room. "We need to talk." His hand moved instinctively toward his vest, but stopped when he saw she wasn't reaching for anything visible. Yet, he was smart enough to sense danger, even if he couldn't quite name its source. "Martha Henley," he said, tasting the name like wine. "Heard you'd gone east. Heard you'd found yourself a new life." "Did you?" She smiled, and something in that expression made the other players push back from the table. "That's interesting, because according to the county records, Martha Henley never existed at all." The silence spread outward like ripples in a pond, conversations dying as people began to sense the electricity in the air. Even the piano player seemed to falter, his melody growing hesitant and strange. Crane's eyes were calculating now, measuring distances and possibilities. "Now, Martha, that's Mrs. Henley to you," she said quietly. "Though I suppose that name doesn't mean much anymore, does it? Not since you took it away." His chair scraped against the floor as he started to rise, but she stepped closer, close enough that he could see the grief and fury that 3 years had carved into her face. "Sit down, Thomas," she said. "We're not finished talking." And in the amber light of the saloon, with the weight of justice heavy in her hand and the taste of vengeance sharp on her tongue, she prepared to reclaim what had always been hers, even if it meant destroying what was left of who she used to be. Time moved like honey in winter as her hand closed around the Colt's grip. The saloon's noise faded to a whisper, then to nothing at all, until the only sound was the thundering of her own heart and the soft whisper of steel against wool. Thomas Crane's eyes widened as understanding dawned, his hand freezing halfway to his vest pocket. In that crystalline moment, she could see every calculation running behind his eyes, the distance to his gun, the proximity of witnesses, the awful mathematics of survival. "Now, Martha," he said, his voice suddenly reasonable, conciliatory, "let's not do anything we'll regret." Regret. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. "You want to talk about regret?" The Colt cleared her shawl with practiced smoothness, and the saloon erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against floor, bodies dove for cover, and somewhere a woman screamed. But in the eye of the storm, she and Crane remained perfectly still, connected by 3 feet of charged air and 3 years of buried rage. "You destroyed my life," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush. "You took my home, my security, my very name. You made me into nothing. The papers were legal. The papers were forgeries." The words exploded from her like bullets. Henry's signature on documents dated after he was already cold in the ground. "You think I didn't know my own husband's hand?" Crane's face had gone pale beneath his perpetual tan, but his eyes remained calculating. "Prove it." The simple challenge hung between them like smoke. Of course, she couldn't prove it. Not in any court that mattered, not against a man with money and influence and friends in high places. That was the beautiful cruelty of his crime, perfect in its execution, invisible in its method. I tried, she whispered. God help me, I tried everything. Lawyers, judges, the sheriff, everyone with the power to help me. You know what they said? She could see her reflection in his eyes now, wild and terrible and finally visible. They said there was no evidence. They said dead men don't sign papers, so the signature must be genuine. They said a grieving widow might be confused about what her husband had or hadn't done before he died. The poker chips on the table seemed to glow like coins in the lamplight, 30 pieces of silver scattered across green felt. Behind her, she could hear the soft shuffle of feet as the other patrons tried to find the courage to flee or the curiosity to stay. So I waited, she continued, the gun steady in her grip. I waited for justice. I waited for someone to care. I waited for God himself to strike you down for what you'd done. Crane's hand twitched toward his vest again, and she stepped closer, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath and the fear in his sweat. But God, it seems, helps those who help themselves. You don't want to do this, Martha. Think about your soul. My soul. She laughed, the sound sharp and broken. You killed my soul 3 years ago when you made me into nothing. When you erased me from existence like I was just another mistake in your ledger book. The saloon held its breath. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause, its ticking fading to silence. In that impossible quiet, she could hear the sound of her own choices crystallizing, becoming real and irreversible. I loved him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry was a good man. He worked hard, treated people fair, never hurt a soul in his life. And you turned his memory into just another tool for your greed. Tears she didn't know she was crying made tracks through the dust on her cheeks. But her hand remained steady, the Colt's barrel never wavering from its target. Say his name, she commanded. What? Say my husband's name. The man whose signature you forged. The man whose property you stole. Say it. Crane's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, and she saw the truth in his hesitation. He'd stolen so much from so many people that he couldn't even remember their names. Henry was just another conquest, another acquisition, another step on his ladder to prosperity. Henry, he finally whispered. Henry Henley, she corrected, and I was Martha Henley, his wife. Not some phantom you could wave away with forged papers and courthouse connections. I was real. I mattered. I existed. The Colt spoke with a voice like thunder. The sound seemed to crack the world in half, splitting time into before and after with surgical precision. Crane's eyes went wide with surprise, then narrow with pain, then empty with the particular stillness that only comes at the end of all things. He fell backward, his chair toppling, his body hitting the sawdust-covered floor with a sound like dropped grain sacks. Blood spread beneath him in a dark pool, soaking into the wood that had absorbed 1,000 spills and now absorbed one more. The silence that followed was absolute, pregnant with the weight of irrevocable choices. She stood over him, the smoking gun still in her hand, and watched as Thomas Crane, thief, forger, destroyer of lives, discovered what it meant to be nothing at all. In his dying eyes, she searched for recognition, for understanding, for some acknowledgement of what he'd taken from her. But there was only confusion and pain and the gradual fading of a light that had burned too hot and consumed too much. My name, she whispered to his unhearing ears, is Martha Henley. The clock on the wall resumed its ticking, and time began to move again. Around her, the saloon came alive with shouts and screams and the thunder of boots on wooden floors. But she remained still, watching the light fade from the eyes of the man who had tried to erase her from the world. Justice, she thought, tasted nothing like she'd imagined. It was bitter and empty and final, leaving her hollowed out rather than fulfilled. She'd reclaimed her name, her existence, her right to be seen and heard and remembered. But in doing so, she'd become something she barely recognized, something terrible and necessary and utterly alone. The sheriff would come soon. There would be questions, accusations, a trial perhaps. They would call her a murderess, and they wouldn't be wrong. But they would also have to acknowledge that she existed, that Martha Henley was real and present and impossible to ignore. In the spreading pool of blood at her feet, she finally saw her own reflection clearly. Not the invisible widow, not the forgotten ghost, but a woman who had chosen to be seen at any cost. The sound of falling stars echoed in her ears long after the gunshot faded, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Dawn found her walking east, away from the town that would wake to find Thomas Crane's blood dried black on the saloon floor and a woman's name finally written in something more permanent than dust. Behind her, the settlement remained mercifully quiet, still hours away from discovering what she'd done. The desert stretched before her like an ocean of possibility and perdition, its vast emptiness offering both sanctuary and judgment. Her boots raised small clouds with each step, and already the weight of civilization was falling from her shoulders like a discarded shawl. She'd spent the night in the jail cell, not because Sheriff Morrison had arrested her. He was too stunned by the evening's events for such decisive action, but because she'd asked for the sanctuary. Just until morning, she'd said, and he'd been grateful to have somewhere to put her while he tried to make sense of what had happened. The questions had been predictable. Why had she done it? How long had she been planning it? Did she understand the gravity of her actions? She'd answered honestly, watching his face change as he began to comprehend the scope of Crane's theft, the elegance of his crime, the impossibility of her situation. Jesus, Martha, he'd whispered when she finished her story. Why didn't you come to me? Would you have believed me? She'd asked. Would you have arrested Thomas Crane on the word of a woman who officially didn't exist? His silence had been answer enough. Now, with the sun painting the eastern horizon in shades of redemption and damnation, she walked into the vastness that had always beckoned from the edges of her known world. The Colt rode heavy on her hip. She'd somehow forgotten to return it to the sheriff, and he'd somehow forgotten to ask for it. Behind her, smoke was beginning to rise from morning cook fires, and she could imagine the conversations that would soon fill every kitchen and street corner. The widow Henley had killed Thomas Crane in cold blood, shot him down like a dog in front of half the town. Some would call it murder. Others might whisper that justice had finally found its way to a man who'd dodged it for too long. But she was no longer concerned with their opinions. She'd spent 3 years caring desperately what people thought, begging them to see her, to acknowledge her existence, to grant her the simple dignity of being remembered. That woman, that desperate, invisible ghost, had died in the saloon last night along with Thomas Crane. The woman walking into the desert was someone new, someone unnamed and unbound by the expectations of civilization. She was no longer Martha Henley, beloved wife and respected woman, nor was she the phantom nonentity that Crane's theft had created. She was something else entirely, something forged in gunpowder and blood and the terrible mathematics of justice. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace, and she envied its freedom. It answered to no law but hunger, recognized no boundaries save those written in wind and weather. It was perfectly, completely itself, needing no one's permission to exist. By mid-morning, the town had vanished behind heat, shimmer, and distance, reduced to a memory that already felt like something from another life. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of brass and copper, and still she walked. Her water would last 2 days if she was careful, 3 if she was lucky. After that, the desert would decide what became of her. She'd brought little from her old life, the Colt, a few dollars in coin, the clothes on her back. Everything else belonged to the woman she'd been, and that woman was dead. Let the lawyers and judges and lawmakers figure out who owned the Henley Ranch now. Let them puzzle over property rights and inheritance laws and the peculiar case of a woman who'd killed the man who'd stolen her identity. She had bigger concerns now. Like the way the desert seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, beautiful and terrible in its indifference. Like the growing ache in her feet and the sun's relentless assault on her exposed skin. Like the question of whether she was walking toward something or simply away from everything she'd ever known. At noon, She paused in the shade of a Joshua tree, its twisted arms reaching toward heaven like a penitent's desperate prayer. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through sage and the distant cry of a coyote. This was what peace felt like, she realized. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of truth so complete that conflict became irrelevant. She thought about Henry, about the life they'd built together and the dreams they'd shared. He'd wanted children, a legacy, something to outlast their small portion of eternity. Instead, his legacy had become her vengeance, his memory transformed into her weapon against the man who'd tried to erase them both. "I'm sorry," she whispered to his ghost, and meant it. She'd loved him with the fierce devotion of a woman who'd never expected to be loved in return, and his death had torn something vital from her chest. But in trying to avenge him, to reclaim what they'd built together, she'd become something he wouldn't recognize. The desert offered no absolution, no easy answers to the questions that clawed at her conscience. It simply existed, vast and patient and utterly honest in its brutality. Here, survival was the only law that mattered, and pretense was a luxury that could kill you. As the afternoon wore on and her shadow grew longer, she began to understand what the desert was teaching her. It wasn't about redemption or punishment or the moral weight of her actions. It was about becoming exactly what you were, stripped of everything false and unnecessary until only the essential remained. She'd reclaimed her name by taking a life, established her existence through an act of destruction. The mathematics of it should have been simple, one death in exchange for one resurrection. But mathematics, she was learning, was a poor tool for measuring the human heart. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Soon it would be dark, and she would have to decide whether to continue walking or to stop and rest, whether to preserve her strength for whatever lay ahead or to exhaust herself in the pursuit of distance from what lay behind. In the end, the choice was made for her. Her legs simply refused to carry her further, and she sank to the ground beside another Joshua tree, its ancient arms offering what shelter they could. The desert stretched around her in all directions, infinite and uncaring, and she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. But not invisible. Never again invisible. She closed her eyes and listened to the desert's evening song, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the cooling whisper of wind over stone, the vast silence that was really the sound of everything that had ever lived and died in this harsh country. Tomorrow, if she lived to see it, she would continue walking. Not toward anything in particular, not away from anything that could truly be escaped, but simply because walking was what the living did. And she was still, against all odds and expectations, undeniably alive. The stars began to appear overhead, hard bright points in the darkening sky, and she thought about the sound of falling stars, the gunshot that had ended one life and begun another. In the morning, she would rise and walk deeper into the desert's embrace, carrying nothing but her name and her guilt and the terrible freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. The desert would keep her secrets, her bones, her story. It would judge her by the same merciless standard it applied to everything else, not by her intentions or her circumstances or the justice of her cause, but by her ability to endure, to adapt, to become exactly what survival demanded. In the vast silence, she discovered that reclaiming a name meant nothing if you'd lost yourself in the taking. But perhaps, in the crucible of the desert's indifference, she might yet discover who she was meant to become. The widow's reckoning was complete. What came next belonged to the woman who would emerge from the wasteland, if anyone emerged at all.